Hey guys, tonight we're delving into the world of ancient history, a time many of us wish we'd been to. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's slowly begin tonight's journey together. The Middle Ages, a period stretching from the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century to the dawn of the Renaissance in the late 15th century, was marked by dramatic changes in society, politics, and culture. Amid these transitions, food and its consumption became a key element that reflected social hierarchy, economic systems, and religious practices. The diet of the time, though shaped by necessity, also acted as a medium for social differentiation, status, and power. Food, in the Middle Ages, was not just a means of survival. It was also a symbol, a commodity, and a reflection of one's place in the broader social order. Access to food and the variety of what one could consume differed vastly, depending on social class. While peasants and serfs subsisted on simple diets based on local seasonal produce, the nobility and royalty enjoyed lavish feasts with exotic ingredients imported from across Europe and beyond. This discrepancy in food access wasn't merely a matter of affluence. It was also influenced by trade routes and the establishment of broader economic networks. As the Middle Ages progressed, with the expansion of trade, food choices began to diversify, though the elite still enjoyed the vast majority of these luxury items. The role of food in medieval society was further defined by the religious and seasonal calendars. The church, as the central religious institution, had a profound influence on what could be eaten and when. Fasting period, particularly during Lent, shaped the diets of Christians, with meat being forbidden for extended periods. For much of the year, the availability of certain foods was governed by the agricultural cycle, which meant that peasants and nobles alike were reliant on seasonal ingredients. Food was often prepared and consumed according to the rhythms of the seasons, with hearty, warming meals in the winter and lighter, vegetable-based dishes in the warmer months. Despite the limitations imposed by geography, climate, and social structure, food was an integral part of everyday life in the Middle Ages. The medieval kitchen was the center of activity for both rich and poor, but the kinds of food prepared and consumed in these spaces varied significantly. At the heart of the diet of the peasantry was bread of food, so central to the Middle Ages that it became synonymous with life itself. For the elite, bread was not just sustenance. It was an indicator of status, with finer breads made from wheat, reserved for the wealthy, while peasants often consumed darker, coarser loaves made from rye and barley. Bread, for both classes, was a central feature of almost every meal, often serving as a plate itself. Beyond bread, vegetables formed the core of the peasant diet. Root vegetables, such as onions, turnips, carrots, and leeks, were grown in abundance, and leafy greens like cabbage and spinach were staples. These vegetables, while simple, were often used to create hearty stews and soups, especially in the cold months when fresh produce was scarce. Peasants typically grew these vegetables in their small plots of land, which were often the most reliable food source they could depend on. Herbs, Foraged wild plants and seasonal fruits also made their way into the peasant kitchen, adding variety and flavor to an otherwise monotonous diet. The life of a peasant in the Middle Ages was one of hard work, and their diet was designed to fuel long hours of labor. However, despite the limitations of their food sources, peasants had access to a few luxuries. For example, eggs, milk, and cheese were common components of their diet, and in some cases, they had access to poultry, pigs, and even cows, while meat was a rarity for the peasant class. When it did appear, it was often in the form of salted pork or occasional game, depending on what could be hunted locally. Pork was particularly prized, as pigs could be raised in small spaces and provided both meat and valuable products like lard, which could be used for cooking or as a preservative, in contrast to the simple and seasonal foods that the peasantry consumed. The meals of the nobility were far more extravagant. Nobles had access to a greater variety of foods, many of which were imported from different regions of Europe and the East. The spices and sugars that were so rare for peasants were an integral part of noble cooking. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and saffron were used to flavor meats, sauces, and pastries, and sugar, though a luxury, was often used to sweeten fruit dishes or to create delicate desserts. Meats, particularly those like venison, swan, and boar, were often roasted and served in large quantities during banquets, accompanied by elaborate sauces and garnishes. For the wealthy, food was a display of power and wealth, a way to showcase their social status. At the heart of the nobility's diet were also grains, though often of a finer variety. White bread made from wheat flour was considered a sign of status, and the wealthier classes consumed bread made with more refined grains, while peasants had to make do with coarser breads made from rye and barley. In addition to bread, the nobility enjoyed a variety of meats, often roasted or boiled in rich sauces. Cured meats, like ham, bacon, and sausages, were also common. Stews, made from lamb or beef, cooked with spices and vegetables, were also popular among the upper classes. The wealthier you were, the more variety and luxury you could afford in your diet. As for beverages, the Middle Ages were a time of beer and wine. For the lower classes, ale was the most common drink, and it was consumed throughout the day, much like water is today. Wine, on the other hand, was mostly reserved for the wealthy, though it was occasionally consumed by the clergy and nobility. Wine was often flavored with herbs and spices, and it was seen as a symbol of status and sophistication. Mead, a fermented beverage made from honey, was also enjoyed, though it was less common than ale and wine. One of the most defining characteristics of the medieval diet was the close relationship between food and religious practices. The church had a profound influence on what could and could not be eaten. For instance, meat was often forbidden during Lent, the 40-day period leading up to Easter, and during other fasting times throughout the year. During these periods, peasants and nobles alike had to find alternative sources of protein, such as fish, eggs, and dairy. Fish, being the preferred substitute for meat during these fasting times, was a highly valued food. Many fish, particularly salted ones, like herring, were preserved for use during the fasting periods. The church's influence also extended to feast days, where special meals were prepared to mark religious celebrations, such as Christmas or the feast of a saint. Food, in the Middle Ages, was not just about sustenance, it was an expression of culture, religion, and class. It played a crucial role in defining social relations, with feasts and banquets acting as both displays of wealth and opportunities for political maneuvering. The food eaten by the nobility demonstrated their control over resources, while the food consumed by the peasants reflected their hard work, scarcity, and dependence on the land. Yet, the medieval period wasn't just about the food available to one class or the other. It was a time when the development of trade routes brought new foodstuffs into Europe. The rise of merchant networks and the discovery of new continents led to the introduction of spices, fruits, and other luxury goods that would eventually change the way food was prepared and consumed in Europe. The connections made through trade had a lasting impact on culinary practices, paving the way for the emergence of new recipes and the exchange of culinary knowledge. In summary, the food of the Middle Ages was not just about filling one's stomach, it was deeply tied to identity, power, and survival. The meals of the peasantry were simple and dictated by the seasons, while the banquets of the nobility were a display of luxury, exoticism, and opulence. Yet, both groups relied on a system of agricultural production and religious practices that governed what they ate. The medieval diet reflects the complexities of a world in transition, one where food was a source of both nourishment and social significance, defining not only what people ate, but also who they were. For the majority of people in the Middle Ages, especially those living in rural areas, the diet was shaped by necessity, scarcity, and the rhythm of the seasons. The peasant diet was largely simple, based on locally available ingredients, and dictated by the cycles of agriculture and weather. Peasants were primarily subsistence farmers, meaning their food choices were determined by what they could grow, raise, or forage. While this diet was far from extravagant, it was designed to be filling and provide the necessary energy for long days of physical labor. The staple food for peasants was grain, particularly rye, barley, and oats. These grains were cheap and easy to grow, and they formed the foundation of nearly every meal. Rye, being the most common grain, was used to make coarse, dense bread that could sustain the peasants throughout the day. This bread, often referred to as black bread, was a far cry from the fine white bread consumed by the wealthier classes. While the nobility enjoyed the soft, airy loaves made from finely milled wheat flour, peasants had to make do with darker, heavier bread made from rye, which could be difficult to chew and digest. Bread was central to the peasant meal. It wasn't just a food to be eaten, it was also used as a utensil. Peasants would tear off pieces of bread and use them to scoop up stews or sauces, a practice that saved on the use of expensive plates and utensils. The importance of bread in the medieval peasant diet cannot be overstated. Was the primary source of calories, and without it, survival would have been much more difficult. Bread, however, wasn't the only way peasants consumed grain. Porridges, made from oats or barley, were also common, cooked with water or milk, and sometimes sweetened with honey or fruit, depending on availability. These porridges provided much-needed sustenance and could be eaten at any time of the day, making them a versatile and easy food source. In addition to grains, peasants relied heavily on vegetables. However, the types of vegetables available were limited to what could be grown locally and what the seasons allowed. Root vegetables, such as onions, leeks, turnips, carrots, and parsnips, were staples of the peasant diet. These vegetables were hardy and could be stored through the winter months, providing a vital source of nutrition during the colder seasons when fresh produce was scarce. Vegetables were typically boiled, stewed, or roasted, and often served alongside bread or porridge. Leafy greens like cabbage and spinach were also common, though these were typically grown in the warmer months. Cabbage was particularly important because it could be stored for long periods, even through the winter, if preserved properly. In some regions, peasants might also grow kale or mustard greens, which were used in soups and stews. Cabbage could also be fermented, much like modern sauerkraut, which allowed it to last through the winter. The use of these hardy vegetables was crucial, especially in the absence of refrigeration or modern preservation methods. Legumes, peas, beans, and lentils were another important component of the peasant diet. These provided essential protein, which was often lacking in the peasant's diet, especially during fasting periods. Lentils and beans could be grown in many regions, and they were relatively easy to store and cook. Peasants often used these legumes in soups or stews, sometimes adding them to dishes already containing vegetables and grains. Legumes could also be eaten as a standalone dish, seasoned with herbs or salt for flavor. They were a vital source of protein for peasants, particularly during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. Despite the heavy reliance on grains and vegetables, peasants had some access to protein, though it was limited. Those who lived near rivers or lakes might catch fish, particularly during fasting times when meat consumption was restricted. Fish such as herring, cod, and eel were often salted or dried to preserve them for longer periods. Salted fish became a staple of the medieval diet, particularly in coastal regions. However, for most peasants, meat was a luxury, consumed only on special occasions or during religious holidays. Pigs were the most common livestock raised by peasants. They were relatively inexpensive to raise and provided both meat and valuable byproducts, such as fat and bones. However, pigs were typically slaughtered in the autumn, and the meat was preserved through salting or smoking. Bacon and salted ham were common in the peasant diet, and pork was often the only form of meat available for much of the year. Occasionally, peasants might have access to chickens or goats, though these animals were less common and often considered a secondary source of meat. Dairy products were also important in the peasant diet, particularly in regions where cows, goats, or sheep were kept. Milk, butter, and cheese were staples of the diet, particularly in rural areas. Fresh milk was consumed when available, though it was often turned into cheese or butter for preservation. Cheese, especially hard cheeses like cheddar, could last for months and provided a reliable source of nutrition, especially in the winter when fresh vegetables and meats were harder to come by. Butter was also used as a cooking fat, although it was often reserved for special occasions or sold for extra income. Fruits were another occasional treat for peasants. Depending on the region and the time of year, peasants might have access to apples, pears, plums, or berries. However, fruits were seasonal and could not be relied upon as a regular part of the diet. In some regions, peasants might also forage for wild fruits, nuts, and berries, such as blackberries, strawberries, and hazelnuts. These were often gathered in the wild and could be eaten fresh or dried for later use. Peasants would also preserve fruits through drying or making fruit preserves, though this was typically reserved for the wealthier classes. Herbs and wild plants played a significant role in the peasant diet as well. Wild greens, such as dandelions, nettles, and purslane, were commonly foraged and added to soups, stews, and salads. These plants were packed with essential vitamins and minerals, helping to supplement the basic diet of grains and vegetables. Peasants might also use herbs like parsley, rosemary, thyme, and sage to flavor their dishes, though these were typically grown in small home gardens. In some cases, medicinal herbs were also used in cooking, both to flavor food and as remedies for common ailments. For the peasant, food was not just sustenance, it was an essential part of survival. The long, hard work days on the farm left little room for indulgence, and the food available was simple and functional. Meals were often repetitive, and variety was limited to what could be grown, raised, or foraged in the surrounding environment. Yet, despite the monotony of the diet, food had cultural significance. It was a vital part of the seasonal rhythm of life, with different dishes and foods marking different times of the year. The harvest was a time of abundance, where meat might be more readily available, while winter brought scarcity and reliance on preserved foods. In conclusion, the medieval peasant diet was simple and based on what could be grown, raised, or foraged. It was a diet shaped by geography, seasonality, and social class. For the peasant, food was essential for survival, providing the calories and nutrition needed for a physically demanding life. Bread, vegetables, legumes, and small amounts of meat or dairy made up the bulk of their diet, with occasional fruits and wild plants adding variety. Though their meals were humble and repetitive, they were reflective of the harsh realities of medieval life. And yet, even in this simplicity, food was more than just a necessity, was a symbol of resilience, resourcefulness, and survival. While the peasants struggled to make do with what they could grow and hunt locally, the nobility of the Middle Ages enjoyed a vastly different experience when it came to food. For the wealthy, the consumption of food was not just about sustenance. It was a means of displaying status, wealth, and power. In fact, food in noble households played a central role in showcasing one's social position. Lavish feasts were held as a demonstration of opulence. Social hierarchies, as the elite consumed foods that were unavailable to the common people. A medieval noble's table would be filled with an abundance of meats, game, fish, fruits, vegetables, and baked goods that went far beyond what peasants could dream of having. The meals were often accompanied by elaborate sauces, fine wines, and the use of costly spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, saffron, and pepper, to name a few. Spices were a particularly valuable commodity in the medieval period. While peasants struggled to afford these luxuries, the nobility could afford them with ease, using them to elevate their dishes and demonstrate their wealth. These spices, many of which were imported from Asia through the growing trade routes, transformed simple meats and vegetables into exotic dishes that were as much about display as they were about flavor. That the centerpiece of many noble meals was meat, roast meats in particular. The Middle Ages saw an abundance of livestock, and for the wealthy, nothing could quite match the extravagance of a well-prepared roasted boar, swan, or venison. These meats were prepared in grand kitchens with great care, often spiced with variety of herbs, and served with rich gravies and sauces. The most elaborate feasts might feature multiple courses of meat, with each course prepared in a different manner. Roasted, boiled, and stewed meats would be alternated, showcasing the culinary diversity and the wealth of the host. Game was another type of meat commonly found on noble tables. The hunting of wild game was a privilege reserved for the aristocracy, and it was an activity that marked one's wealth and status. Deer, wild boar, and even birds like pheasant and partridge were sought after for their tender meat and distinct flavor. These dishes were often served alongside fruits, vegetables, and breads, adding a natural sweetness and depth to the meals. For example, venison might be paired with a sauce made from dried fruits like raisins or prunes, or even sweetened with wine, creating a perfect blend of savory and sweet. The art of seasoning and pairing flavors was a mark of nobility, as the wealthy could afford the time and resources to perfect their dishes. Fish, while also part of the diet of peasants, played a much larger role in the noble diet, particularly during religious fasting periods when meat was prohibited. Fish became a symbol of indulgence for the upper classes. Salted fish, especially herring, was common, but more luxurious varieties of fish, such as sturgeon and salmon, were often served at feasts. The nobility would enjoy these fish either fresh or preserved, served with a variety of seasonings and sauces that would further highlight their exclusivity. Fish, like meat, was also accompanied by breads, sauces, and fruits, transforming it into a meal fit for royalty. In addition to these lavish main dishes, these included finely baked breads and pastries, often made from the best wheat flour available. Fine breads, made from white wheat flour, were the standard in noble households, whereas peasants consumed darker, coarser breads made from rye and barley. These breads were often served with rich butters, cheeses, and pates foods that could be spread on the bread to add flavor and texture. Pastries were another notable feature of noble feasts. These sweet or savory pies, often filled with meat, vegetables, or fruit, were a popular addition to meals. The complexity and richness of these pastries were symbolic of the noble lifestyle, as they required both skill and wealth to prepare. Noble cooks had the time, resources. Desserts were also an essential part of noble feasts, though they were not as common for peasants. These desserts often featured sugar, a luxury item that only the wealthy could afford. Sugar was used in a variety of ways, from sweetening fruit, preserves, and jams to creating candied fruits and sugar-based pastries. Honey, while less expensive than sugar, was also used as a sweetener, and honey cakes were enjoyed by both the nobility and common folk. Noble feasts, however, often included more elaborate sugar creations, such as marzipan sweets or confections, which were delicate and refined, showing off the wealth and taste of the host. Wine and ale were the common beverages at noble feasts. Wine, especially red and white varieties, was favored, but it was often mixed with spices and sometimes even honey to create a sweeter, more complex drink. The wine served at these feasts was typically imported either from local vineyards or from regions like France and Italy. Wine was often reserved for the wealthiest members of society, and its consumption at a feast was seen as an indication of social status. Food was not only a matter of nutrition, it was an event. The preparation and consumption of food were grand affairs that involved multiple courses, elaborate settings, and extravagant presentation. Nobles would often hire professional cooks who were skilled in creating meals that appealed to both the senses and the eye. These meals were not just for sustenance, but were designed to make a statement. To be invited to a noble banquet was to be immersed in a world of luxury, flavor, and cultural richness, a world that was inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. One of the most significant aspects of the noble feast was its role in reinforcing social hierarchies. The ability to host a grand feast was not only a demonstration of wealth, but also a way to gain influence and power. Feasts were held to mark important events such as weddings, military victories, or royal celebrations, and were attended by other members of the elite, who often competed for social favor through displays of generosity and abundance. The food served at these feasts, along with the accompanying wines and sweets, the food enjoyed by the nobility during the Middle Ages was a stark contrast to that of the peasantry. The elite indulged in lavish feasts filled with exotic meats, fish, rich sauces, fine wines, and sugary treats. The use of spices, which were rare and expensive, elevated these meals, making them not just about taste, but about showcasing wealth and power. The noble feast was a key part of medieval society, playing a central role in both everyday life and in the broader social and political landscape. It was a world of abundance, where food was not just nourishment, but a symbol of the hierarchy and luxury that defined medieval aristocracy. Bread was, without a doubt, the cornerstone of the medieval diet. Whether for peasants or nobles, bread played a crucial role in daily sustenance, acting as both a food source and an essential part of the culture. For the majority of the population, it wasn't just a side dish, it was the primary vehicle for consuming other foods, acting as a plate, a utensil, and a base for other dishes. The importance of bread in the Middle Ages cannot be overstated, as it not only provided sustenance, but was also an indicator of social class, and it was consumed in a variety of ways across different regions and by different classes. The grains that made up medieval bread varied depending on geography, climate, and social standing. For the vast majority of peasants, the primary grain used in bread making was rye flour, while dense and coarse, was much cheaper and more abundant than wheat flour, which was typically reserved for the wealthy. Rye bread, often referred to as black bread, was the daily staple of peasant life. This bread was heavy and hearty, and while it was nutritious, it lacked the softness and fine texture of the white bread consumed by the upper classes. Rye bread had a strong flavor, and its dense texture made it filling, but it could also be difficult to chew. It often served as the base for a meal, with chunks of bread used to soak up broths, stews, or sauces. The bread eaten by the nobility, however, was a much finer product, made from wheat, which was more expensive and harder to come by. Noble bread was light, airy, and soft. This bread, often referred to as white bread, was a symbol of status. The wheat used for this bread was finely milled, resulting in a smooth, soft texture. The refinement of the flour and the bread-making process were indicative of wealth and luxury, as only the aristocracy could afford the time, effort, and cost to produce such fine loaves. White bread, often accompanied by butter, cheese, or preserved meats, was a luxury that reinforced the division between the rich and poor. Bread was consumed at nearly every meal, and it often served as the foundation for a variety of dishes. For the lower classes, bread might be eaten alongside simple vegetable stews or porridge, while the nobility would pair it with rich meats, cheeses, and elaborate sauces. In fact, bread was often used as a utensil. It was common for medieval people to tear off pieces of bread and use them to scoop up soup, stews, or meat. This practice was not only practical, but also a way of conserving resources. The bread served as a sort of plate, reducing the need for costly or time-consuming dishware. At feasts, where wealth and grandeur were on full display, it was common to serve meat dishes on large platters made entirely of bread. While bread was a central feature of the medieval meal, it wasn't always the same every day. The process of baking and the ingredients available varied with the seasons. In areas where wheat was grown, noble households might enjoy a variety of breads, each with its own flavor profile and texture. Sweet breads and pastries, often flavored with honey or spices, were sometimes served as treats during feasts and religious holidays. In addition, the shape and decoration of bread were often used to mark special occasions. For example, breads made in intricate shapes, such as loaves shaped like animals or religious symbols, were created for weddings, religious feasts, and other celebrations. In some regions, bread was not just an essential food. It was also used as a medium for ritual and religious purposes. The Christian Church had a significant influence on how bread was prepared and consumed, particularly with the institution of the Eucharist. During Mass, the priest would consecrate bread, transforming it into the body of Christ. This religious bread was of great importance, and it was often made with the finest flour available. While this was a sacred and symbolic use of bread, it was nonetheless a reflection of its central role in the culture and economy of the Middle Ages. The relationship between bread and class was also evident in the way it was prepared and sold. In towns and cities, bakeries were common, and the baker's role was vital to the community. The process of bread making was a skilled trade, and bakers would often produce bread in large quantities, which was then sold in the market. The quality of the bread often reflected the status of the customer. The wealthy could afford to purchase finely baked wheat bread, while the poor had to settle for the coarse rye loaves. Some towns even had regulations regarding the size and price of bread, ensuring that bakers didn't take advantage of the poor by selling inferior or overly expensive products. These regulations were part of broader attempts to manage the food supply, especially in cities where bread was a primary food source for much of the population. For the peasant, bread making was often an activity that took place in the home, as peasants typically grew their own grain and would have the means to mill it into flour. Once the grain was harvested, it would be ground in a local mill, and the flour would be used to make bread. However, this process was labor-intensive, and baking bread was a significant task that could take hours of preparation. Peasants usually baked their bread in communal ovens, which were shared by the entire village. These ovens were often large brick structures that required significant heat to bake large batches of bread. This communal approach to bread baking created a sense of shared responsibility and solidarity, as the success or failure of the bread baking process had communal implications. One of the most important features of medieval bread was its ability to preserve well. Bread was often baked in large quantities, and leftovers could be used for several days. Stale bread was not discarded, but instead repurposed into other dishes. For example, bread could be soaked in broth to create a simple, filling soup or pottage. In fact, stale bread was sometimes deliberately made and stored for later use, as it would absorb liquids more easily, adding thickness and texture to soups and stews. This repurposing of bread was a sign of the resourcefulness that was necessary in medieval life, where waste was not tolerated and every scrap of food had value. Bread was also sometimes flavored with ingredients that were not typically associated with modern bread making. Herbs, garlic, and even fruits were sometimes added to bread, depending on the region and the time of year. In some cases, bread might be flavored with spices such as cinnamon or cloves, though these were expensive and not commonly used in peasant bread. Spices were primarily reserved for the wealthy who could afford such indulgences. These flavored breads were a treat, often served at feasts or during special occasions. In some parts of Europe, bread was considered so vital that it was even used as a form of currency. In medieval France, for example, bread was sometimes used as a way to pay taxes or debts. Bread was so closely tied to the economy and daily life that it became a form of trade in its own right. The phrase breaking bread was not just a metaphor for sharing a meal. It was a literal practice that allowed people to exchange food in times of need. The bread offered at the medieval table wasn't just food. It was also a symbol of sustenance, of community, and of survival. In conclusion, bread was far more than just a basic foodstuff in the Middle Ages. It was a symbol of life itself, a measure of social standing, and a vehicle for nutrition and culture. For peasants, it was the foundation of every meal, while for the nobility, it was a refined luxury that marked their wealth and status. Bread was central to the rhythms of daily life, providing the energy needed for long, hard work days and sustaining the entire population through harsh winters and lean times. It was a food that transcended class and geography, uniting people in a shared experience of sustenance, while also reflecting the stark differences between the lives of the rich and the poor. Meat was a significant part of the medieval diet, but for the vast majority of the population, it was a luxury that could not be afforded every day. While bread and vegetables formed the staple diet for peasants, meat played a more prominent role in the meals of the nobility and royalty. However, even for the wealthier classes, meat consumption was often controlled by strict economic and social rules, with only certain types of meat being considered acceptable or desirable, and certain meats being reserved for special occasions. 4. The peasant's meat was a rare indulgence, typically reserved for feasts, religious holidays, or exceptional moments. The majority of the time, they relied on less expensive animal products, such as eggs, milk, and cheese, which were more readily available and could be consumed in greater quantities. Hunting was often restricted by law, with many areas having designated hunting grounds controlled by the nobility. Only the wealthy could afford to keep large herds of livestock for meat production, and even then, meat was often salted, smoked, or preserved in other ways to ensure it lasted for months. Pork was the most common type of meat consumed by peasants when they could afford it. Pigs were relatively easy to raise and provided a steady supply of meat, fat, and other useful products. Peasants would slaughter pigs in the fall, and the meat would be cured through salting or smoking to ensure it could last throughout the winter months. Sausages, hams, and salted bacon were some of the most common forms of preserved pork, and these would be eaten throughout the year. Pork, with its rich, fatty taste, was the primary meat source for peasants, as it could be produced locally and required less investment than other types of livestock. Beef and lamb were less common, but still occasionally consumed by peasants. These meats were typically reserved for special occasions or religious feasts, and in some cases, the meat of older animals was used in stews or soups. However, cattle were primarily raised for their milk and hides, while sheep were raised for their wool and milk. In these cases, the meat of these animals would only be consumed when they were no longer productive. For example, old cows or sheep that were past their prime might be slaughtered for their meat, though this would happen infrequently. For the nobility, however, meat was more than just a source of protein. It was a display of wealth and power. The wealthier classes could afford to eat meat more regularly, often with elaborate sauces and seasonings that elevated its flavor. The types of meat consumed by the nobility ranged from the domesticated to the exotic, and the preparation methods varied according to the delicacy of the meat. Common meats in noble households included beef, lamb, venison, and poultry, all of which were prepared in ways that demonstrated both skill and luxury. One of the most prized meats for the nobility was venison, the meat of deer. Hunting deer was an exclusive privilege granted to the nobility, as hunting rights were typically reserved for those of high rank. Venison was often roasted or served in pies, paired with rich sauces made from wine, fruits, and spices. It was considered a delicacy, and its consumption at banquets or feasts was a way for nobles to show off their wealth and status. The gamey flavor of venison was complemented by the use of exotic spices such as cinnamon and saffron, which would infuse the meat with a distinct aromatic flavor. Another popular meat among the nobility was poultry, particularly swan, pheasant, and peacock. These birds were often roasted or boiled and served with complex sauces. Swans, in particular, were a symbol of wealth and luxury, as they were not only rare but also difficult to acquire. These birds were often served in a spectacular manner at feasts, sometimes even with their feathers still intact, arranged in elaborate presentations to showcase the host's ability to procure such rare and expensive meats. Pheasants and peacocks were also roasted and served in their entirety, making a striking impression at banquets. The nobility took great pride in their ability to procure and serve such luxurious meats, and these extravagant dishes were often accompanied by highly spiced sauces to enhance the flavor of the meats. Meat consumption among the nobility was not just about the meats themselves. It was also about how the meats were prepared and presented. The medieval noble feast often featured elaborate dishes that combined meats with fruits, spices, and sauces, creating a complex balance of flavors. For example, venison might be paired with a sauce made from dried fruits such as prunes, raisins, or figs, while roasted poultry could be served with a glaze made from wine, honey, and spices. These dishes were designed to showcase the chef's skill and the wealth of the host, and they often involved intricate preparation methods that were not accessible to the peasant class. The consumption of meat in the Middle Ages also depended on the time of year. In the fall, as animals were slaughtered for the winter, there was a greater abundance of fresh meat available. However, during the colder months, when fresh meat was scarce, preservation methods like salting, smoking, and drying were used to keep meat available year-round. Salting and smoking were the most common preservation techniques for meat, especially pork and beef. Salted and smoked meats could last for months, allowing them to be consumed throughout the winter when fresh meat was no longer available. This preserved meat was often eaten with bread, vegetables, and grains, as it added flavor and variety to otherwise monotonous meals. Game meats were also highly valued and were often reserved for the wealthiest members of society. Wild boar, hare, and rabbit were some of the game meats enjoyed by the upper classes, and they were often roasted or made into stews. These meats were considered a sign of nobility, as hunting was a skill and privilege reserved for the aristocracy. Wild game was typically prepared in ways that highlighted its rich earthy flavors, often enhanced with wine, fruit, and aromatic herbs. While meat was an essential part of the medieval diet, it was not the sole source of protein. Fish, particularly in coastal regions, was another important part of the noble diet. Fish was often consumed during periods of religious fasting, when meat was forbidden, but it also appeared regularly in the noble household. Salted and dried fish were common, but fresh fish, like salmon, sturgeon, and eel, were highly prized and often featured at feasts and banquets. In conclusion, meat was an important, though often scarce, part of the medieval diet for peasants. It was a rare luxury, consumed mainly during special occasions, with pork being the most commonly eaten meat. For the nobility, meat was a symbol of status and wealth, and it was consumed regularly, often in lavish banquets and feasts. Game, meats, poultry, and even exotic birds like swans and peacocks were highly prized, and their preparation was a demonstration of culinary skill and luxury. The use of spices, sauces, and complex cooking techniques transformed meat into a dish that was not just about nourishment, but also about power, prestige, and indulgence. Meat was, without a doubt, the star of the table for the medieval elite, and its role in the diet of both peasants and nobles reflects the deeply rooted social hierarchies that defined medieval society. In the Middle Ages, fish and seafood played a vital role in the diet, especially during times when the consumption of meat was restricted by religious observances such as Lent. During this period, the Church required its followers to abstain from eating meat on certain days, such as Fridays, or throughout Lent, in favor of fish or other animal products. This practice made fish a primary source of protein for much of the population, especially for those living in coastal regions or near rivers and lakes. While peasants generally had limited access to fresh fish, the wealthy could enjoy an abundance of fish and seafood, and it became a symbol of both religious piety and luxury. The types of fish consumed in the Middle Ages varied depending on geography and seasonality. Coastal communities had access to a wide range of fish, including cod, herring, salmon, and eel, while those living inland typically relied on river fish such as trout, pike, and perch. Salted fish was a common form of preservation, especially in regions far from the coast. Salted herring, for example, was widely consumed and could be stored for long periods, making it an essential foodstuff during the colder months when fresh fish was unavailable for the peasantry. Fish was often a rare commodity, but it was still consumed during fasting periods. Many peasants who lived near rivers, lakes, or the sea would catch fish using simple fishing techniques such as nets, traps, or hand lines. Fish was often salted or dried to preserve it for future use, and these preserved fish could be eaten throughout the winter months when fresh food was scarce. Fish was not only a source of protein, but also an important food for its versatility. It could be added to soups, stews, or pies, and could be boiled, roasted, or fried, depending on what was available. Salted fish was sometimes eaten with bread, or mixed with vegetables to make it more filling. Nobles, however, had a much wider variety of fish and seafood to choose from. Fish was often served at feasts, especially during Lent, when meat was forbidden. The wealthy could afford the luxury of fresh fish, as well as exotic types of seafood, such as oysters, mussels, and even lobster, which were considered delicacies. Nobles could also enjoy fish in a variety of preparations, stewed or baked in savory pies and pasties. Fish was sometimes paired with sauces made from herbs, wine, or even fruit, creating complex and refined flavors that highlighted the skill of the cooks. Salted fish, like herring, was particularly important in the medieval diet, especially in areas where fresh fish was not easily obtainable. Salted fish was a crucial part of the medieval diet, as it could be stored for months without refrigeration. It was particularly important during the Catholic fasting periods, when the consumption of meat was prohibited. In fact, salted fish was often consumed by both peasants and nobles alike during these times, as it was one of the few animal products that could be consumed in place of meat. In addition to herring, cod was another popular fish in the Middle Ages. Cod was prized for its abundance and the fact that it could be salted and dried for preservation. It was so essential to the diet that entire industries were built around its preservation and trade. The salt cod trade, in particular, was one of the most lucrative medieval industries. Cod was exported to many parts of Europe, where it was consumed as a staple food. The dried and salted cod was often soaked before being cooked and used in a variety of dishes, from simple stews to complex casseroles. While the consumption of fish was widespread throughout medieval Europe, the wealthy elite had access to even more luxurious forms of seafood. Oysters, mussels, and other shellfish were considered a delicacy and were often served at the grandest feasts. These shellfish were either gathered from the shores or farmed in special oyster beds. Oysters, in particular, were highly prized by the nobility and were often served as a starter or an accompaniment to other dishes. They were sometimes served in their shells, seasoned with herbs, wine, or vinegar, and eaten as a form of appetizer. Mussels and other shellfish were also popular at noble feasts, served in a variety of preparations. Mussels were often steamed or boiled and served with rich sauces made from butter, wine, or garlic. Other shellfish, such as lobster, were sometimes boiled and served with elaborate garnishes, making them an impressive feature at banquets. These seafood delicacies were enjoyed not only for their flavor, but also for their rarity and the prestige associated with serving them. Nobles often considered seafood to be a symbol of sophistication, and its presence at a feast was a mark of wealth and refinement. Despite the wealth of fish and seafood available to the upper classes, the diet of peasants was more limited. Fresh fish was typically only available to those who lived near bodies of water, and even then, it was not a regular part of the diet. The fish that was consumed was often dried or salted to preserve it, and it was usually eaten during religious fasts. Salted herring, for instance, could be eaten as part of a meal with bread, or it might be boiled and served with vegetables. For peasants, the fish that they consumed was primarily utilitarian, serving as a substitute for meat during religious observances rather than a luxury food. Fish, like other foods in the Middle Ages, was subject to religious and social influences. The Church's fasting rules not only dictated when meat could be eaten, but also encouraged the consumption of fish during certain periods. The fasting rules were meant to purify the body and soul, and fish was considered a more suitable food for the faithful during times of fasting. During Lent, for example, fish became the main source of protein for many people, particularly those who could not afford meat or could not access other sources of protein, such as eggs or dairy. Fish was also associated with purity, and its consumption during fasting was seen as a way to align with religious practices and principles. In conclusion, fish and seafood were vital components of the medieval diet, particularly during religious fasting periods when meat was forbidden. While peasants had limited access to fresh fish, salted and dried fish provided a crucial protein source. For the nobility, however, fish and seafood were symbols of wealth and luxury. The variety of fish available, including herring, cod, oysters, and lobster, made fish a prominent feature of noble feasts. The trade in salted fish, particularly cod, played an important role in the medieval economy, and the consumption of fish became deeply intertwined with religious practices. Whether enjoyed as a humble, preserved food by peasants or as a luxurious delicacy by the aristocracy, fish remained an essential part of the medieval diet, nourishing the population and reflecting the social and religious structures of the time. While grains, meat, and fish were the most obvious components of the medieval diet, dairy products played an equally important, though often overlooked, role in sustaining the population, especially in rural areas where livestock was readily available. In the medieval period, dairy was not just a byproduct of animal husbandry, but an essential food source that offered both nutrition and versatility in the kitchen. Whether it was milk, butter, cheese, or cream, dairy products provided peasants and nobles alike with a reliable source of protein, fats, and vitamins that were crucial for their survival and overall health. For peasants, dairy products were primarily sourced from animals such as cows, goats, and sheep, while the wealthier classes might have access to a variety of dairy products. For peasants, the most common forms of dairy were milk, butter, and cheese. In rural settings, where access to fresh meat was often limited, dairy was a much-needed protein source. The animals themselves were central to peasant life. Cows provided milk, goats gave milk and meat, and sheep were valuable for their wool, milk, and meat. These animals were integral, not just for food, but also for the many other resources they provided, such as hides for clothing and furs for warmth. Milk was a common food for peasants, though it was consumed in different forms and in varying quantities depending on availability. Cows provided the most milk, especially in regions with fertile pastures, while goats and sheep were often kept by peasants who lived in more mountainous or less fertile areas. Milk would often be consumed fresh or used to make cheese and butter. Fresh milk was usually consumed by the household in the morning or evening, but it was also preserved by turning it into butter or cheese. In this way, dairy became a crucial food source during the winter months when fresh vegetables, fruits, and meat were in short supply. Butter, made from churning cream, was another key dairy product in the peasant diet. While butter was often reserved for special occasions or holidays, it was still a common addition to meals. For example, it was spread on bread or used to cook vegetables and grains. However, butter was also a valuable commodity that could be traded for other goods or services. In medieval society, butter could be exchanged for things like flour, eggs, or even money, depending on the region. As a rich source of fat, butter was essential for providing the energy required for the physically demanding work of farming and other rural occupations. Cheese, perhaps the most enduring and versatile dairy product in medieval cuisine, was a food that could be preserved and stored for long periods. Unlike milk and butter, which were perishable, cheese could be made in large quantities and kept for months without spoiling. This made cheese particularly important in medieval times, especially for those living in rural areas without access to refrigeration or modern preservation techniques. Sheep's milk, goat's milk, and cow's milk were all used to make a variety of cheeses, each with distinct flavors and textures. Cheesemaking was an essential skill, and it was often done on a household level. Peasants would typically make fresh cheeses such as ricotta or cottage cheese, which could be consumed immediately or used in cooking. Hard cheeses, like cheddar or Gouda, were made for long-term storage and could be eaten throughout the year. These cheeses were often consumed with bread or used in stews and soups, providing both protein and fat to sustain peasants through harsh winters. Cheese could also be preserved by smoking or salting, further extending its shelf life. For the nobility, dairy products were a mark of luxury, and cheese in particular was a highly prized food. While peasants consumed simple, rustic cheeses, nobles had access to a wide range of refined cheeses, some of which were imported from other parts of Europe. Cheese at noble feasts was often served as a course in its own right, accompanied by bread, fruits, and wine. The variety of cheeses available to the wealthy was impressive, ranging from soft, creamy cheeses to aged, crumbly varieties. Some cheeses were even flavored with herbs, spices, and wine, adding complexity to the meal and elevating cheese from a simple food into a sophisticated indulgence. In addition to its importance in food, dairy was also used for non-culinary purposes. For example, the fats and oils from milk and butter were often used for medicinal purposes. In the absence of modern pharmaceuticals, butter and milk were often believed to have healing properties, and they were used in various remedies for skin conditions, digestive issues, and other ailments. Dairy was also used in the preparation of certain types of pastries and desserts, where milk and butter provided a rich base for sweet treats that would be enjoyed during feasts or holidays. Despite its importance in the medieval diet, dairy products were not universally accepted or consumed by all segments of society. In some areas, dairy products were seen as a food for the lower classes, while others particularly in rural communities, viewed them as a fundamental part of their diet. The nobility, however, embraced dairy as a luxury item, and it became a symbol of wealth and indulgence, especially in the form of aged cheeses and fine butter. The availability of high-quality dairy products was one of the ways the elite distinguished themselves from the peasantry, as the production of fine cheeses and butter required both skill and resources that were often beyond the reach of the common folk. The church also had a significant influence on the consumption of dairy, particularly during fasting periods. While meat was forbidden during Lent and other religious observances, dairy products were allowed. This made dairy a crucial component of the medieval diet, especially for those who were fasting. Cheese and butter were often consumed as substitutes for meat, providing an alternative source of protein and fat. In some regions, the church even encouraged the consumption of dairy, as it was considered an acceptable form of nourishment during fasting periods. In conclusion, dairy products played a crucial role in the medieval diet, offering a source of protein, fat, and vitamins that was essential for both peasants and nobles. For the common folk, dairy was a necessity that provided sustenance, especially during the winter months when other food sources were scarce. For the elite, dairy became a symbol of luxury and refinement, with fine cheeses and butter served at banquets and feasts. Whether in the form of fresh milk, butter, or cheese, dairy was a vital part of the medieval foodscape, nourishing the population and adding richness and variety to the meals of both the wealthy and the working classes. Nutritional value, but also for their role in providing variety and flavor to an otherwise monotonous diet. However, the consumption of fruits and vegetables varied widely depending on one's social status and geographical location. For the wealthy, fruits could be exotic, imported from distant lands, and served in elaborate dishes or preserved as luxury items. For peasants, the consumption of fruits and vegetables was more dependent on what could be grown locally and what was available during each season. Even with the limited availability, fruits and vegetables still provided vital nutrients, vitamins, and minerals, and they played a central role in shaping the medieval diet. The agricultural cycle of the Middle Ages was defined by the seasons, with each season bringing a different set of available fruits and vegetables. In the warmer months, vegetables like peas, beans, onions, leeks, and cabbage were commonly grown in peasant gardens, while fruits like apples, cherries, and berries were harvested from orchards and hedgerows. These fresh fruits and vegetables were essential for keeping the population healthy, especially when meat was scarce or during fasting periods. However, the availability of these foods was heavily dependent on the season, and during the winter months, fresh fruits and vegetables became rare. The primary vegetables consumed in medieval Europe included root vegetables like turnips, carrots, parsnips, and radishes, which were hardy enough to withstand the colder months and could be stored through the winter. Turnips were particularly important as they were one of the most common and affordable vegetables available. These root vegetables were used in a variety of dishes, from soups and stews to being boiled or roasted and eaten on their own. Vegetables, like onions and garlic, were also widely used in cooking, both for their strong flavor and their medicinal properties. They were frequently added to stews, soups, and sauces to enhance the taste of otherwise plain dishes. Cabbage was another common vegetable, both for its hardiness and for its ability to be preserved through fermentation. The method of fermenting cabbage, creating something similar to modern sauerkraut, allowed it to be stored and consumed throughout the winter. Other leafy vegetables, such as kale, spinach, and mustard greens, were also grown and eaten, though they were often less common and dependent on the local climate. Fruits, while less prevalent in the peasant diet, still had a significant role. In medieval cuisine, apples were especially important as they were widely cultivated in orchards and could be stored for months after harvest. In addition to being eaten fresh, apples could be turned into cider, an alcoholic beverage that was commonly consumed in both rural and urban areas. Pears and plums were also enjoyed fresh and could be used to make preserves, jams, or even wines. Berries were another seasonal fruit that grew wild in many regions. These preserves could be stored for the winter months, providing a sweet treat during the colder seasons when fresh fruit was no longer available. While peasants had access to these wild fruits, they were also valued by the nobility, who might incorporate them into pies, tarts, and other sweet pastries. In addition to the more common fruits, some wealthier households could access more exotic varieties through trade. The Crusades and expanding trade routes brought new fruits from the East, including figs, dates, and pomegranates. These fruits were expensive and only available to the aristocracy, often served at banquets or feasts, to showcase the host's wealth and access to luxury goods. For example, pomegranates, which were imported from Spain and North Africa, were prized for their bright red seeds and sweet tart flavor. Filled with a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, which were grown in nearby gardens or brought in from surrounding villages. These markets were the places where both peasants and nobles could buy seasonal produce. Nobles had the privilege of purchasing the best and most exotic fruits, while peasants had to make do with the more common and locally grown varieties. The differences in the quality of produce between the classes were often stark, with the wealthiest enjoying the finest and freshest fruits, while the lower classes made do with what was in season and readily available. The preservation of fruits and vegetables was a significant concern, especially during the winter months when fresh produce was scarce. One of the main methods of preserving fruits and vegetables was through drying. Fruits like apples, pears, and plums were often dried and stored in cool, dry places to be used during the colder months. This allowed medieval people to continue consuming fruits when fresh ones were no longer available. Vegetables, too, were preserved through drying, and peasants often dried beans, peas, and other legumes to store for the winter. Pickling was another method of preservation. Vegetables like cucumbers, onions, and cabbage were often pickled in vinegar or brine to be consumed during the winter months. The cultivation of fruits and vegetables in the Middle Ages was also influenced by the agricultural practices of the time. The three-field system, which involved rotating the cultivation of crops on 3 different fields, allowed for the better use of land and increased agricultural productivity. This system helped ensure that there would always be some fresh produce available for consumption. However, the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables was still largely dependent on the seasons. Medieval farmers relied heavily on the natural cycles of the land, with harvests taking place in late summer and early autumn, and the preservation of food becoming a critical part of their survival during the winter months. Fruits and vegetables also had an important role in medieval medicine. Many fruits, herbs, and vegetables were considered to have medicinal properties and were used in various remedies. For example, garlic was thought to have healing properties and was commonly used as a treatment for various ailments, from digestive issues to infections. Similarly, apples were often considered to have a purifying effect on the body, and apple cider vinegar was used as a remedy for digestive problems. Herbs such as parsley, mint, and sage were not only used for culinary purposes, but also for medicinal purposes, helping to alleviate a wide variety of ailments. In conclusion, fruits and vegetables played an important, though often overlooked, role in the medieval diet. While peasants had limited access to exotic fruits and relied heavily on local seasonal produce, they still managed to incorporate a variety of vegetables and fruits into their meals, providing essential nutrients. For the nobility, fruits and vegetables were a symbol of wealth and luxury, and they had access to a far wider range of fresh, exotic fruits through trade. The preservation of fruits and vegetables through drying, pickling, and other methods ensured that these vital food sources could be consumed throughout the year. Despite the challenges of seasonality and availability, fruits and vegetables provided vital sustenance and helped to shape the medieval diet, offering not just nutritional value, but also variety and cultural significance. Herbs and spices were more than mere flavorings in the Middle Ages. They were deeply embedded in the culture, economy, and health practices of the time. While today we may take for granted the variety of herbs and spices available at our local markets, in medieval Europe, these ingredients were often rare, expensive, and highly coveted, particularly by the wealthy. They were not only used to enhance the taste of food, but also served as symbols of wealth and power, markers of sophistication, and even as medicine or protection against disease. For the peasants, herbs and spices were a luxury when available. Though many could still access simple herbs grown locally for culinary and medicinal use, in the kitchens of the nobility, herbs and spices were used to create complex, aromatic dishes that reflected the status and sophistication of the host. The trade routes that expanded throughout the Middle Ages, particularly during the Crusades, introduced a wealth of exotic spices from the East. These spices, including cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron, became highly prized commodities. In medieval Europe, they were used to flavor meats, sauces, sweets, and even drinks. The sheer expense of these ingredients meant that they were largely inaccessible to peasants, who could rarely afford them. Instead, they relied on local herbs like parsley, thyme, and garlic to enhance the flavor of their meals. The use of spices was as much about cultural and religious symbolism as it was about flavor. The Catholic Church, with its strict fasting rules, often allowed the consumption of spiced dishes during fasting periods where meat was forbidden. During these times, spices helped to make simple fish and vegetable dishes more palatable and enjoyable. Spices, like cinnamon and cloves, with their sweet and warming qualities, were also thought to have medicinal properties and were used to promote digestion, prevent illness, and even ward off the plague. In fact, some spices were so highly regarded for their purported health benefits that they were considered as valuable as gold. Cinnamon, one of the most coveted spices, was used in a variety of dishes, from savory meat stews to sweet pastries. It was particularly prized by the nobility, who used it to flavor roasted meats, sauces, and even drinks. Cinnamon also had religious significance, often being used in the preparation of holy oils or incense. The complex aroma and heat it provided made it a favored spice for both culinary and symbolic purposes. Likewise, cloves, which were imported from Southeast Asia, became a staple in the kitchens of the wealthy. Cloves were used to add a pungent, spicy kick to dishes, and they were often paired with other spices like nutmeg and ginger to create the distinctive flavors of medieval cuisine. Nutmeg and ginger, both exotic spices, were used to flavor sweet and savory dishes alike. Nutmeg, imported from the Spice Islands modern-day Indonesia, was a symbol of luxury and refinement in the Middle Ages. It was used to enhance sauces, meats, and even desserts. Ginger, also imported from the East, was valued for its warming properties and was commonly added to stews and pies. Both of these spices were costly, and their presence in a dish marked it as one of wealth and opulence. While peasants could rarely afford such ingredients, the nobility made them a hallmark of fine dining. Saffron, another luxurious spice, was a key ingredient in the kitchens of the wealthy. It was prized not only for its unique flavor, but also for its vibrant yellow color, which was often used to give dishes a rich golden hue. Saffron was most commonly used in soups, rice dishes, and pastries, and it was considered a spice that signified wealth and prestige. The process of harvesting saffron was labor-intensive, as each flower produced only a small amount of the spice, making it extremely expensive. Its scarcity and expense meant that only the wealthiest households could afford to use it regularly, while the nobility had access to these exotic spices. The common folk were more likely to use local herbs and seasonings to flavor their food. Garlic, onions, and leeks were commonly used by peasants to enhance the taste of bread, stews, and soups. These herbs were widely available, easy to grow, and relatively inexpensive, making them a staple in the peasant kitchen. Parsley, sage, thyme, and rosemary were also commonly grown in herb gardens, and they were used to flavor a variety of dishes. These herbs, though not as exotic as cinnamon or saffron, added essential flavor and fragrance to the food of the common people. Other herbs, such as mint, dill, and tarragon, were also used, though their availability was more limited. In addition to their culinary uses, many herbs were believed to have medicinal properties and were used to treat a range of ailments. For example, mint was thought to aid digestion and freshen breath, while sage was believed to improve memory and relieve sore throats. Medieval people, both peasants and nobles alike, often turned to herbs for their healing properties, creating herbal remedies and potions to treat everything from common colds to more serious illnesses. Herbs and spices also played a significant role in medieval trade. The establishment of new trade routes, particularly during the Crusades, opened up the flow of spices from the East to Europe. This trade in spices became so important that it was directly linked to the rise of powerful merchant guilds and cities. Spices were traded along complex networks that connected the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence became major centers for the spice trade, with merchants importing spices from as far away as India, China, and the islands of Southeast Asia. The influence of spices on medieval cuisine cannot be overstated. The introduction of exotic spices into European kitchens transformed the way people thought about food and flavor. Before the widespread use of spices, European cuisine was largely bland, relying on simple ingredients like grains, vegetables, and basic meats. However, as spices became more available, medieval cooking became more complex and flavorful, and new culinary techniques emerged. Spices were often used not just to flavor food, but to preserve it as well. Salt, another essential ingredient, in medieval kitchens, was frequently combined with spices to cure and preserve meats, fish, and even fruits and vegetables. This practice allowed food to last longer and helped to ensure that people could survive through the lean winter months. The growing demand for spices also led to the rise of wealthy merchant families who made their fortunes by controlling the spice trade. These merchant families, along with royal courts and the Catholic Church, were some of the primary consumers of spices. The wealthy would spend vast sums of money to acquire the finest spices, and the demand for these exotic flavors contributed to the expansion of global trade networks that would continue to shape European economies for centuries to come. In conclusion, herbs and spices were not only an important part of medieval cuisine, but also essential to the culture, economy, and social structure of the time. While peasants made do with locally available herbs to flavor their meals, the nobility enjoyed a wide range of exotic spices that transformed their food into something truly luxurious. Spices were symbols of wealth, power, and sophistication, and they played an essential role in shaping the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages. The importation of spices from the East also fueled trade and economic development, contributing to the rise of merchant cities and the expansion of global trade routes. For both peasants and nobles, herbs and spices were vital to the flavor, health, and culture of the medieval world. Wine and ale were the beverages of choice throughout the Middle Ages, enjoyed by people of all social classes, albeit in different ways. In fact, drinking was so integral to medieval life that it was often more common for people to drink their daily calories in liquid form than to eat solid food. The medieval diet was designed for survival, and both wine and ale played crucial roles in daily life, whether as a source of nutrition, a ceremonial beverage, or a symbol of social status. The availability, quality, and variety of these drinks differed greatly depending on one's social class, location, and season. For peasants, ale was the common drink of choice, while the nobility often had access to fine wine from distant vineyards. Ale, a fermented beverage made from barley or wheat, was a staple of the medieval diet, particularly for peasants. It was consumed at almost every meal and served as a primary source of hydration. The brewing of ale was a common practice in both rural and urban communities, and it was often brewed at home. In fact, many medieval households had their own brewing equipment and recipes. Ale was an essential part of the medieval diet because it was a safe alternative to water, which was often contaminated. Due to the fermentation process, which killed harmful bacteria, ale was considered much safer to drink than water, especially in cities where water supplies could be tainted. For peasants, ale was a daily necessity. It was consumed not just for its nutritional value, but also as a way of celebrating, socializing, and coping with the difficult conditions of medieval life. Ale was consumed at meals, during work in the fields, and in the evenings to unwind. In fact, ale was often served in large quantities, as it was a cheaper and more accessible drink than wine. The type of ale that peasants drank was typically dark, thick, and relatively low in alcohol. This ale was often brewed with rye or barley, depending on what was available, and it had a heavy, earthy flavor. It was not uncommon for ale to be flavored with herbs, spices, or fruits, and in some regions, fruit ales made with apples, berries, or honey were popular. Ale was not just a drink, it was a key part of social interaction. Pubs, inns, and taverns were common places where people gathered to drink, converse, and exchange news. These places were centers of community life, particularly in urban areas. People would gather in the evening to drink ale, share stories, and relax after a long day of work. Alehouses also served as venues for business dealings, political discussions, and other communal activities. These drinking establishments were often run by women, as brewing ale at home was traditionally seen as a woman's responsibility. Ale, as they were called, would brew and sell ale to the local community, often adding their own personal touches to the recipe to create unique flavors. The medieval nobility, on the other hand, had access to a different range of alcoholic beverages, particularly wine. Wine was an expensive and prized drink, often imported from regions like France, Italy, or Spain, and it was primarily consumed by the wealthy. The rise of viticulture in medieval Europe led to the development of vineyards across the continent, with many aristocratic families owning or controlling wine-producing estates. Wine was a symbol of wealth and sophistication, and its consumption was often restricted to the upper classes. Wine was enjoyed in a variety of ways. The nobility often drank wine during meals, but it was also consumed at social gatherings and feasts. At these events, wine would be served in large quantities, often accompanied by elaborate courses of food. Wine was typically served in goblets or chalices, and the quality of the wine served was a direct reflection of the host's wealth and status. The best wines, such as Bordeaux or Burgundy, were often reserved for special occasions or as gifts to show favor or gratitude. The wine served at these banquets was usually red, though white wines were also popular, particularly in regions where they could be grown. For the nobility, wine was not just a drink, it was part of a broader culture of luxury. The preparation and presentation of wine were important, and wine was often mixed with herbs, spices, and sometimes even honey to create different flavors. Some wines were flavored with cinnamon, cloves, or other spices to enhance their taste, while others were sweetened with honey or sugar. In addition to the fine wine served at feasts, wine was also consumed in smaller quantities as part of daily life, often diluted with water to make it more refreshing or to extend its supply. One of the most important aspects of wine in medieval society was its association with religious rituals. Wine played a central role in the Christian Eucharist, where it symbolized the blood of Christ. The use of wine in religious ceremonies made it an essential part of the life of the clergy, as well as a symbol of divine favor and grace. In addition to the sacred role of wine, it was also a key part of the feasts and celebrations that marked important religious holidays. Wine was consumed in large quantities during festivals such as Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of saints. While the nobility drank wine as a symbol of luxury, the growing popularity of wine in medieval Europe also had economic and social implications. The production of wine became an important industry in many parts of Europe, especially in regions with favorable climates for viticulture. The demand for fine wine helped to shape the economy of these regions, as wine merchants, vintners, and landowners profited from the sale of wine to both the wealthy elite and the growing middle class. Wine became an important part of the medieval trade networks, with wine merchants traveling across Europe to sell their goods, while ale was consumed by peasants and wine by the nobility. There were also other beverages enjoyed by medieval people. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, was popular in some regions, particularly in Northern Europe. Mead was considered a drink for warriors, as it was believed to imbue strength and courage. In Scandinavia and the British Isles, mead was consumed in large quantities, often during feasts and celebrations. Mead was typically sweet, with a strong honey flavor, and it was sometimes flavored with herbs or spices to enhance its taste, in addition to alcoholic beverages. People in the Middle Ages also drank non-alcoholic beverages, such as herbal teas, water, and fruit juices. These drinks were consumed for medicinal purposes, as well as for enjoyment. Herbal teas made from plants like mint, chamomile, and sage were popular for their soothing properties, and fruit juices, particularly those made from apples or berries, were consumed as refreshing alternatives to water. In conclusion, wine and ale were integral to the medieval diet, playing crucial roles in both nutrition and culture. Ale, the drink of the common people, was consumed daily by peasants and served as a source of hydration and nourishment. Wine, on the other hand, was a luxury enjoyed by the nobility, symbolizing wealth, power, and sophistication. Both beverages were deeply entwined with the social and religious life of medieval Europe, with wine playing a key role in religious rituals and ale serving as a focal point of community life. These drinks not only shaped the medieval culinary landscape, but also reflected the societal divisions that defined the era. The Church played a profound role in shaping the food culture of the Middle Ages, influencing what could be eaten and when. Through religious doctrine, the Church dictated not only the spiritual practices of medieval society, but also how people related to food. Fasting, a fundamental part of Christian life during the Middle Ages, shaped the medieval diet by restricting certain foods, especially meat, and promoting the consumption of fish, dairy, and other substitutes. However, there was a fine balance between these periods of deprivation and the grand feasts that marked religious celebrations and holy days. These religious observances directly affected what was eaten, when and how, and as such, the Church's influence permeated both the humble peasant kitchens and the opulent noble banquets. Fasting, as prescribed by the Church, was one of the most important features of medieval religious practice. It was believed that fasting purified the soul and allowed one to grow closer to God by abstaining from earthly pleasures, including food. The Church established numerous fasting periods throughout the year, including Lent, Advent, and other times leading up to significant feast days. During these fasting periods, meat, particularly red meat, was forbidden, and those who followed the fasting rules were expected to refrain from eating anything that came from warm-blooded animals. The Church's fasting laws had a significant impact on the medieval diet, particularly in how people found alternatives to meat. The most common substitute for meat during these fasting periods was fish. While peasants and the lower classes generally had access to fresh fish from local rivers, lakes, and the sea, the wealthy could afford a wide variety of fish, including exotic species that were often imported from distant regions. Salted fish, especially herring, cod, and mackerel, were common during these periods of abstinence, as they could be preserved and stored for long periods of time. Fish was not only a spiritual alternative to meat, but also a versatile food that could be incorporated into various dishes such as stews, pies, and roasted preparations. Fish, when seasoned with herbs and spices, could provide the richness of a meat dish without violating the Church's rules. In addition to fish, peasants often turned to other animal products such as eggs, milk, and cheese to supplement their diets during fasting times. Dairy products like butter and cheese were permitted during fasts, and they became a vital part of the medieval diet for those looking for substitutes to meat. Peasants would often make their own cheese, butter, and yogurt, which could be stored for months and were a reliable source of fat and protein during times of fasting. Similarly, eggs, which were produced by chickens, were another acceptable food during fasting periods, as they came from warm-blooded animals but were not considered meat. This allowed for a broader range of food options during times of religious deprivation. The Church also had a say in how food was prepared during fasting times. For example, certain types of food were considered to be richer or more indulgent and were thus forbidden. Foods that were considered luxuries, such as butter, were generally forbidden during fasting periods. However, some monasteries and religious communities took a more lenient approach to fasting, allowing for the use of more simple, plant-based fats, like olive oil, in place of animal-based fats. The specific rules for fasting varied from region to region and order to order, with some groups adhering strictly to the prohibition of all animal-based foods, while others allowed more flexibility, especially for those in need. On the opposite end of fasting were the grand feasts that marked the religious calendar. These feasts, which were celebrated during key points in the Christian liturgical year, provided an opportunity for indulgence and celebration. They were times when the fasting laws were lifted and people were able to feast on rich, indulgent foods that were otherwise restricted. Feast days were tied to important religious events such as Christmas, Easter, and the feast days of saints, and these events were often marked by extravagant banquets that included all the foods that had been previously forbidden during fasting periods. For the nobility, these feasts were often elaborate affairs, with multiple courses of meats, wines, and sweets. Feasts like Christmas and Easter were especially significant, as they marked the highest points of the Christian liturgical calendar. At these times, the Church's restrictions on food were lifted, and celebratory feasts were held in churches, monasteries, and noble homes. The nobility often hosted large, multi-course feasts that could last for hours, with a wide variety of dishes, from roasted meats and fish to complex pastries and sugary treats. In these feasts, meat was the highlight, with large quantities of venison, beef, lamb, and poultry being served alongside fine wines and elaborate sauces. The serving of rare or exotic dishes, often seasoned with expensive spices, showcased the host's wealth and hospitality. For the church and the nobility alike, feasts were a way to honor important religious events and demonstrate piety, as well as to celebrate the end of fasting periods. The concept of fasting and feasting also tied into the church's role in shaping social order and class distinction. For peasants, the religious feasts marked times of celebration, but they were not always able to partake in the extravagant banquets of the nobles. While peasants might have enjoyed simple meals of meat and bread during these celebrations, the opulence of noble feasts was beyond their reach. However, for peasants, the religious feasts were still important moments for community gatherings, where food was shared and eaten communally. These moments allowed people to take part in the greater religious celebrations of the time, even if they could not partake in the extravagance that the nobility enjoyed. In addition to the religious feast days, certain foods were associated with particular saints or events in the Christian calendar. For example, fish might be consumed on the feast day of St. Peter, or special cakes and pastries might be prepared to honor the Virgin Mary. The Church's influence on food wasn't just about fasting and feasting, it also extended to the foods that were considered holy or blessed. These foods were often prepared and consumed with reverence, as a way to honor the saints or to symbolize spiritual nourishment. Beyond fasting and feast days, the Church also played a role in food production and trade. Many monasteries had extensive gardens and farms where they grew fruits, vegetables, and herbs, not only for sustenance, but also for use in religious rituals and medicines. Monks and nuns were often responsible for brewing beer, making wine, and producing dairy products like cheese. These products were sometimes sold or traded to generate income for the monastery, but they were also consumed by the monks and used in religious ceremonies. The Church's involvement in food production allowed it to influence the food economy, both locally and regionally, as monasteries became centers of agricultural and culinary activity. In conclusion, the Church's influence on medieval cuisine was profound, shaping not just what was eaten, but also how it was consumed. The practice of fasting dictated much of the diet, particularly during religious observances like Lent, when meat was forbidden and fish, dairy, and vegetables took center stage. Feasting, in contrast, was a time of indulgence, when restrictions were lifted and the nobility, in particular, could enjoy rich meats, wines, and sweets. These feasts were not only a means of celebrating religious events, but also served as opportunities to showcase wealth and power. For peasants, religious feast days provided an occasion for community celebration, but their meals were far more modest compared to the opulent feasts of the wealthy. Ultimately, the Church's fasting and feast practices profoundly shaped the medieval food culture, leaving an enduring legacy in the way food was viewed and consumed. Sweets and desserts were far less common in the medieval diet than they are today, especially for peasants and lower-class people. In fact, the majority of medieval meals were savory and based around bread, meat, fish, and vegetables, with very little room for indulgent, sweet confections. However, for those who could afford them, Sweets and desserts provided a means of celebrating special occasions and showcasing wealth. The nobility, in particular, enjoyed a range of sweet treats, many of which were rich in sugar, honey, and spices, creating flavors that were considered exotic and indulgent by the standards of the time. While sugar was still an expensive commodity in the medieval period, it gradually became more accessible to the wealthy, allowing for the creation of elaborate desserts and confectionery. For the peasantry, however, sweets were an exception rather than the rule. The cost and scarcity of sugar meant that it was rarely used in peasant kitchens. Instead, sweeteners like honey or fruit were the most common sources of sweetness. Honey was an essential product in medieval Europe, especially before the widespread use of sugar, and it was used in a variety of ways, from sweetening drinks to being incorporated into baked goods. Honey cakes, spiced with cinnamon, ginger, or nutmeg, were some of the few sweets available to peasants, and they were often enjoyed during religious feasts or as special treats. Fruits, too, were an important source of sweetness in the medieval diet. In the summer months, fresh fruits like apples, pears, plums, and berries were harvested and eaten as a natural dessert. These fruits were sometimes preserved through drying or in preserves, allowing them to be enjoyed during the winter months. While fresh fruits could be consumed directly or used in simple pies and tarts, fruit preserves were a more common method of ensuring that sweet flavors were available year-round. Fruit preserves, often made with berries, apples, or figs, were sweetened with honey and used to accompany bread, cheese, or meats. The upper classes, however, had access to a more diverse array of sweets and desserts, many of which were far more elaborate and luxurious. Sugar, which was imported from the Middle East, became an increasingly important ingredient in medieval confectionery. As sugar became more available in Europe, it was used to make a variety of sweet treats, including syrups, candies, and cakes. Some of the most extravagant medieval desserts were created with sugar and spices, reflecting the growing wealth and sophistication of the nobility. Sugar was often combined with spices like cinnamon, ginger, and cloves to create sweet treats that were rich, aromatic, and complex in flavor. These desserts were often served at grand feasts and banquets, where the nobility would indulge in cakes and pastries that were more elaborate than anything the peasantry could afford. For example, sugar was used in the creation of marzipan, a sweet paste made from almonds and sugar that was molded into various shapes, often resembling fruits, animals, or flowers. Marzipan became particularly popular in noble households, where it was used to create intricate sugar sculptures and cakes that were as much about presentation as they were about taste. Other popular sweets for the aristocracy included spiced fruit pies, custards, and sweet pastries filled with almonds, figs, or dates. These pastries were often filled with honey and sprinkled with sugar, making them a luxurious indulgence. Tarts and pies made from fruits like apples and pears were also common desserts for the nobility, and they were often sweetened with sugar or honey and flavored with spices such as cinnamon and nutmeg. These desserts were usually served with wine or ale at feasts and social gatherings, adding to the celebratory atmosphere of these events. In addition to fruit-based desserts, medieval chefs often prepared sweet sauces that could be poured over cakes, puddings, or roasted meats. One example was a sugar syrup, which was made by boiling sugar with water to create a thick, sweet liquid. This syrup could be poured over fruit, bread, or even meat dishes to add a sweet contrast to savory flavors. The practice of pairing sweet sauces with meat dishes, such as roast duck with fruit sauce or venison with a sweet berry glaze, was common in noble kitchens, where chefs experimented with complex flavor combinations that blended sweet, savory, and spicy tastes in some cases. Sugar and spices were used to create edible sculptures or intricate decorations for feasts. Sugar sculptures, made by boiling sugar into various shapes, were sometimes used to decorate the tables at banquets, where they were admired as much for their artistic value as for their taste. These sugar creations could be shaped into flowers, animals, or other elaborate designs, and were often the centerpiece of the dessert table at large feasts. These intricate sugar artworks reflected the wealth and prestige of the host, demonstrating their ability to procure rare and expensive ingredients, as well as their refined taste and creativity. Despite the luxurious nature of these sweets, it's important to note that the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages, particularly peasants, had little access to these indulgences. Sweets, sugar, and exotic ingredients were largely reserved for the wealthy elite, who could afford to import these items from distant lands. For peasants, the idea of having a sweet dessert was a rare luxury, and their diets were primarily composed of simple, savory foods. When sugar did make its way into peasant kitchens, it was often in small quantities, used sparingly as a sweetener in cakes, preserves, or beverages. However, religious feast days and special occasions allowed for moments of indulgence for peasants when they could partake in whatever sweets or treats were available. During holidays like Christmas and Easter, when fasting rules were relaxed, peasants would enjoy richer foods, including honey cakes, fruit pies, and sweet breads. These moments, though few and far between, allowed for a brief escape from the restrictions of daily life and provided an opportunity for communities to come together and celebrate. In conclusion, sweets and desserts in the Middle Ages were a luxury enjoyed primarily by the wealthy. Sugar, which was expensive and difficult to obtain, was a prized commodity in noble households, and its use in the creation of elaborate pastries, cakes, and confections was a symbol of status. For peasants, sweets were rare, and when they were enjoyed, they were often simple and based on local ingredients like honey, fruits, and herbs. Despite these differences in access, sweets played a significant role in medieval food culture, symbolizing not only indulgence and celebration, but also the growing availability of exotic ingredients and the increasing complexity of medieval culinary traditions. The creation of desserts, whether simple or elaborate, reflected the changing tastes and growing wealth of medieval society, marking the importance of food as a symbol of status, community, and culture. In medieval Europe, food preservation was crucial for survival, especially during the long, harsh winter months when fresh produce, meats, and dairy were not readily available. The lack of refrigeration, modern preservatives, and even basic storage methods meant that medieval people had to rely on a variety of techniques to ensure that food could be kept from spoiling. Preservation techniques were essential not only for providing sustenance during lean times, but also for maintaining an efficient food supply throughout the year. Ensuring that the population was well fed regardless of seasonal or geographical limitations. One of the most common methods of preserving food in the Middle Ages was salting. Salting was especially important for preserving meats and fish. Salted meats, particularly pork, beef, and game, were essential for survival in rural areas where fresh meat was often a rare luxury. Pork was the most commonly salted meat, and it was often cured in large quantities during the fall after pigs were slaughtered. The process involved rubbing salt into the meat, then allowing it to cure for several weeks or months. Once cured, salted meat could be stored for extended periods, providing a reliable source of protein throughout the year. Similarly, fish, such as herring and cod, was salted to preserve it for use during times of fasting or when fresh fish was unavailable. Salted herring, in particular, was a popular preserved food that could last for months, and it was often consumed by both peasants and the nobility, especially during religious fasting periods. Another crucial preservation method was smoking. Smoking meat and fish helped to dry them out and infuse them with a distinctive flavor while also protecting the food from spoilage. The smoking process worked by exposing the meat to smoke from burning wood, which dried out the food and created a protective layer of chemicals that helped prevent the growth of bacteria. Meat, such as ham or bacon, was often smoked, and it could be kept for long periods without spoiling. Fish, such as salmon and mackerel, was also commonly smoked, and smoked fish could be eaten throughout the year, even during the cold winter months when fresh food was scarce. Smoking was also used to preserve sausages and other meat products, adding flavor and extending their shelf life. Drying was another key method of food preservation in medieval Europe. Drying worked by removing moisture from the food, which made it difficult for bacteria to grow and spoil the product. Dried fruits, such as apples, plums, and raisins, were common in medieval kitchens, and they could be used in cooking or stored for later use. Vegetables were also dried to ensure that they could be eaten during the winter months. Beans, peas, and lentils were often dried and stored in sacks for use in soups, stews, and other dishes. Dried herbs, such as thyme, rosemary, and sage, were used for both culinary and medicinal purposes, and they could be stored for months without losing their potency. Preserved grains, such as barley, oats, and wheat, were also a crucial part of medieval food storage. Grains could be harvested in the summer or fall and stored in granaries or barns, where they could be kept safe from pests and moisture. The grains were often ground into flour, which was then used to make bread and porridge. The ability to store grains for long periods of time was essential for surviving the winter months when fresh vegetables and fruits were no longer available. The storage of grains was a common practice in medieval Europe, and it ensured that there would always be a supply of food available, even in times of scarcity. In addition to these preservation methods, pickling was another technique used to preserve both vegetables and fruits. Pickling involved soaking food in vinegar or brine, which helped to prevent the growth of bacteria and preserve the food for later use. Vegetables, such as cucumbers, onions, and cabbage, were commonly pickled, and these preserved foods could be eaten year-round. Pickled vegetables were often served alongside meats and bread, providing both flavor and variety to the diet. The process of pickling was also used for fruits, such as pears and apples, which could be preserved in syrup or vinegar. Pickled foods were an important part of the medieval diet, as they provided a means of consuming fresh vegetables and fruits during the winter months. Fermentation was another technique that played a role in food preservation in the Middle Ages. Fermented foods, such as sauerkraut and yogurt, were consumed for both their nutritional value and their ability to be stored for long periods. Sauerkraut, made from fermented cabbage, was a common food in medieval Europe, especially in regions where cabbage was grown in abundance. The fermentation process made the cabbage more digestible and created a sour, tangy flavor that was a favorite of both peasants and the nobility. Yogurt, made from fermented milk, was another popular food that could be preserved and consumed throughout the year. Fermented dairy products, such as cheese, were also important in medieval diets, as they could be stored for months and provided a reliable source of protein and fat. The preservation of liquids, such as wine, ale, and vinegar, was also important. In medieval kitchens, wine, which was often made from locally grown grapes, was stored in barrels or casks and could be consumed throughout the year. Wine was a staple in both noble and peasant households, and its preservation was crucial to ensure a constant supply. Ale, which was brewed in medieval homes and taverns, was also stored for future consumption. Ale was often consumed daily and was a primary source of hydration for both peasants and nobles. Vinegar, made from fermented wine or beer, was used, not only as a condiment, but also as a preservative for pickling and marinating foods. One of the more specialized forms of preservation involved the use of honey. Honey, due to its natural preservative properties, was used to preserve fruits, nuts, and other foods. Honey was particularly useful in preserving small fruits like berries or figs, as it created a sweet, sticky environment that prevented spoilage. Honey was also used to make mead, a fermented alcoholic drink, which could be consumed throughout the year. The use of honey for preservation was a practice that dated back to ancient times and continued to be important in medieval food culture. Food preservation was not just a matter of ensuring survival through the harsh months of winter. It was also a matter of economy and trade. In many parts of Europe, preserved foods were traded, allowing communities to exchange goods and ensure that they had access to a variety of food sources. The preserved meat and fish trade was especially important, as salted and dried meats could be transported across long distances, feeding people far from where the food was originally produced. The trade in preserved foods helped to create a network of commerce and ensured that no region was entirely dependent on its local food supply. In conclusion, the preservation of food in the Middle Ages was essential for survival. Without modern refrigeration or preservation techniques, medieval people relied on methods such as salting, smoking, drying, pickling, fermenting, and using honey to ensure that food could be kept for long periods. These methods allowed people to survive through the lean winter months when fresh food was scarce, and they helped to create a robust food economy that supported trade and commerce. Whether it was meat, fish, vegetables, or dairy, the preservation of food in the Middle Ages was a crucial aspect of daily life, ensuring that the population remained nourished year-round and that food could be transported and traded across regions. As the Middle Ages progressed, Europe became more interconnected through the expansion of trade routes, particularly after the 11th century. The development of these trade networks dramatically transformed the medieval foodscape. The movement of goods, ideas, and people across Europe and beyond allowed for the introduction of new foods, spices, and cooking techniques that would influence the medieval diet for centuries to come. By the time of the late Middle Ages, Europe's kitchens were more diverse than ever, thanks to the fruits of exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. The Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, were pivotal in opening up direct trade routes to the Middle East and Asia. These military expeditions allowed Europeans to interact with the Byzantine Empire, North Africa, and other regions where goods like spices, fruits, and even new agricultural practices were introduced to the West. Spices, in particular, became a highly coveted commodity. These exotic ingredients, such as saffron, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, were transported through trade routes known as the spice routes, linking the East with Mediterranean and European markets. These spices were not only used to flavor food, but were also thought to have medicinal properties, enhancing their appeal. As trade flourished, European merchants began to import other luxury items as well. The demand for silk, fine textiles, glassware, and perfumes grew, but food and drink were at the forefront of the exchange. Spices like black pepper and ginger became staples in the kitchens of the wealthy, while the lower classes continued to rely on local, more affordable herbs for flavor. These imports allowed for an explosion of culinary innovation among the nobility, where chefs began to experiment with new flavors and methods of preparation. Complex sauces, highly spiced meats, and exotic desserts became synonymous with the lavish feasts of medieval royalty and the aristocracy. Trade also introduced new fruits and vegetables to Europe, many of which were cultivated in the Middle East, India, or even Africa. Items such as citrus fruits, particularly oranges and lemons, were rare in Europe before the medieval period, but became more common after being introduced via trade routes. Similarly, sugar, which had been a luxury item reserved for the wealthiest classes, began to be produced in larger quantities after the establishment of sugar plantations in the Mediterranean. This allowed for a more widespread use of sugar in the kitchen, particularly in the form of jams, preserves, and sweet pastries, giving rise to more complex medieval desserts. Sugar's availability also marked the beginning of its association with wealth and refinement, particularly in the creation of marzipan and other sugar-based confections. Beyond the Mediterranean, the age of exploration began to further expand the global exchange of food products. The voyages of explorers like Christopher Columbus in the late 15th century connected the New World with Europe, opening the door to even more foodstuffs. New World crops such as tomatoes, potatoes, maize, corn, and beans began to be introduced into European diets, though these foods wouldn't become widely adopted until the Renaissance. Their introduction marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of European cuisine. For the time being, however, the most significant impact of exploration on medieval food came in the form of the spices and sweeteners that were transported across the seas. The rise of commercial hubs and port cities, such as Venice, Genoa, and Barcelona, further facilitated the exchange of food and ingredients. These cities, located along the Mediterranean coast, became important centers of trade where goods from the East were brought in, processed, and sold to a broader European market. The growing demand for luxury goods drove innovation and wealth, particularly among merchants who made their fortunes by controlling the flow of foodstuffs and spices. The spice trade, in particular, became so lucrative that it led to the establishment of dedicated merchant routes and trading posts in places like the Arabian Peninsula and the Indian Ocean. European traders could now access a greater range of products, including new foods, grains, dried fruits, and even rare drinks like coffee and tea, both of which would go on to transform social life in the centuries to come. Even though the wealthy had access to the finest spices and exotic ingredients, the medieval diet of the lower classes remained grounded in local produce and homegrown fare, while peasants benefited from the availability of herbs, vegetables, and small amounts of preserved or salted meats. The true luxury of trade was reserved for the upper echelons of society. In cities, marketplaces were filled with fresh produce from surrounding villages, but the peasants rarely had access to exotic spices or fruits. While the spread of goods through trade and exploration enriched the culinary offerings of the wealthy, it was still the lower classes who sustained the core agricultural practices that fed Europe. For peasants, trade's impact was not as immediate, but it was still felt. In regions that were close to trade centers or port cities, peasants might begin to grow crops that were favored by merchants or even experiment with new crops imported from afar. For example, the expansion of the cultivation of wine grapes, a product that had been traditionally grown in the Mediterranean, began to spread across Europe. This led to the rise of vineyards in regions that had never produced wine before, from northern France to the British Isles. Despite the growing complexity of the medieval food system, the expansion of trade also highlighted the disparities in access to food, the wealth and luxury of the aristocracy, who could indulge in dishes filled with spices, exotic fruits, and rare meats, stood in stark contrast to the lives of peasants who ate simple, seasonal dishes of grains, vegetables, and occasional meat. The rising trade in spices and luxury foods contributed to this divide, where the wealthy were able to savor the culinary innovations resulting from global exchanges, while the lower classes subsisted on basic sustenance. Trade also led to a transformation in how food was perceived. The exchange of spices and fruits symbolized the growing interconnectivity of the world and the expanding horizons of medieval Europe. Where once only the wealthy could experience these luxuries, the trade allowed for greater consumption among those who could afford it. For the nobility, having access to rare ingredients from the East became a display of power and status, signaling wealth and a cultured sophistication. The rich, vibrant flavors and the delicate presentation of these imported goods were part of the larger effort to elevate social events and establish an elite identity. In conclusion, the influence of trade and exploration in the Middle Ages dramatically shaped the medieval food landscape. Trade routes opened up the exchange of spices, fruits, vegetables, and other foodstuffs that enriched the diets of the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. Spices, once rare and highly valuable, became a staple of aristocratic cuisine, adding complexity to their dishes and enhancing their social status. For peasants, however, these new foods and ingredients were often out of reach, as their diets remained largely rooted in locally sourced produce and preserved foods. Yet, the spread of these goods marked a turning point in medieval culinary practices and laid the foundation for future cultural exchanges that would continue to shape European cuisine in the centuries to come. The legacy of medieval cuisine, though rooted in a time of scarcity and simplicity for many, has profoundly influenced the way we eat today. As food systems became more complex through trade, exploration, and the development of new preservation techniques, medieval culinary practices laid the foundation for modern cooking traditions in Europe and beyond. The interplay of regional ingredients, the introduction of new spices, and the rise of a merchant class eager to indulge in food as both a necessity and a symbol of status, all contributed to a culinary transformation that endures in our kitchens. Today, one of the most enduring legacies of medieval cuisine is the continued use of spices. The medieval period saw the first widespread use of many spices we still use today, such as cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron, and pepper. These spices were prized not only for their ability to elevate the flavor of food, but also for their medicinal properties and the status they conferred upon the user. Today, these spices remain essential ingredients in many global cuisines. The rich, aromatic qualities of these spices, once a sign of wealth and sophistication, are now accessible to people from all walks of life. Thanks to the global trade networks established in the medieval period, for example, cinnamon and cloves continue to be used in both savory dishes and desserts, while saffron still plays an important role in dishes like paella and risotto. Medieval cooking also introduced many preservation techniques that would endure for centuries. Methods like salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were developed and refined to ensure that food could be preserved for long periods, especially during winter or during religious fasting periods. These techniques were crucial in an age without refrigeration and have been adapted into modern food preservation methods. For example, the art of curing meats, particularly bacon and hams, continues to be practiced worldwide. Similarly, pickling and fermenting vegetables, fruits, and dairy products is still a common practice in many cultures. The use of salt to cure fish, a tradition that began in the medieval period, remains a hallmark of certain cuisines, especially in coastal regions. The role of bread in the medieval diet also continues to be felt today. Bread, which was the cornerstone of the medieval peasant diet, remains a central food in many cultures around the world. While medieval bread was often coarse and dense, modern artisan breads owe their existence to the techniques developed in the Middle Ages. The use of different grains, the rise of yeasted doughs, and the eventual refinement of baking techniques were all innovations that took root during this period. Medieval bakers were highly skilled, and their ability to craft breads with different textures, flavors, and shapes laid the groundwork for the diverse bread offerings available to us today. Even the art of baking breads with unique flavors, such as rosemary bread or seeded loaves, can be traced back to medieval practices where herbs and spices were often added to the dough to enhance flavor. Meat consumption in the Middle Ages also left its mark on modern diets. While meat was scarce for peasants, the nobility enjoyed a wide variety of meats, often in large quantities. The techniques for roasting, braising, and preparing meats in sauces that were popular during the Middle Ages continue to influence how we cook meat today. The use of spices and herbs to enhance the flavor of meats, particularly in the preparation of game like venison, which was popular in noble kitchens, was a hallmark of medieval cooking. Modern stews, roasts, and meat pies owe much of their complexity to these medieval culinary traditions. The introduction of new fruits, vegetables, and cooking methods in the Middle Ages was another significant development. The medieval period saw the introduction of fruits like citrus, dates, figs, and pomegranates into European diets, especially among the wealthy. These fruits, though rare in the medieval period, have since become staples in global cuisine. The medieval fondness for pairing fruits with meats and incorporating them into sauces has also persisted into modern cooking, especially in European and Middle Eastern cuisines. Dishes like roast duck with fruit sauce or lamb with apricots continue to be popular in many cultures. Similarly, the medieval practice of incorporating vegetables into hearty stews and soups remains an important culinary tradition. The use of root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips, as well as leafy greens like cabbage and kale, has continued into modern times. These vegetables, once integral to the peasant diet, are now enjoyed by people of all social classes. Today, vegetables like cabbage are featured in a wide variety of dishes, from soups to side dishes, and they are valued not only for their nutrition, but also for their versatility in cooking. Perhaps one of the most lasting legacies of medieval cuisine is the concept of the banquet or feast. The elaborate feasts enjoyed by the nobility during the Middle Ages set the stage for modern celebratory meals. The idea of serving multiple courses, with each course featuring different types of food ranging from meats to pastries, sauces, and desserts remains a hallmark of modern fine dining. The medieval tradition of creating complex, multi-course meals has evolved into the modern concept of the gourmet meal, with intricate flavors, careful presentation, and attention to detail. Moreover, the concept of food as a display of wealth and social status, which was so evident in medieval feasts, still resonates today. The tradition of showcasing rare or luxurious ingredients, such as truffles, caviar, and foie gras, can be traced directly back to the medieval period, where such items were the preserve of the elite. The continued use of these luxury ingredients in high-end restaurants and its celebratory occasions highlights the long-standing connection between food and social status that began in the Middle Ages. Lastly, medieval food preservation techniques laid the foundation for modern food production and storage systems. The development of methods like salting, drying, and pickling contributed to the food security of Europe, enabling people to survive long winters and periods of famine. Today, modern food preservation techniques such as refrigeration, canning, and freezing have advanced far beyond the methods of the past. But the basic principles of food preservation remain largely the same. The medieval practice of preserving food for later use can still be seen in the modern-day reliance on canned goods, dried fruits, and frozen vegetables, which ensure that food is available year-round. In conclusion, the culinary innovations of the Middle Ages have had a lasting impact on modern food culture. The spices, meats, vegetables, fruits, and preservation techniques that were developed and refined during this period continue to shape the way we eat today. The exchange of goods through trade and exploration, the evolution of cooking techniques, and the introduction of new ingredients all contributed to a richer, more diverse culinary landscape that persists into the present. While the medieval period was marked by social divisions and dietary restrictions, its culinary legacy is one of abundance, complexity, and global exchange elements that continue to influence our palates and kitchens today. End of script. Sweet dreams.